Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of MOPA in Focus. Thanks for joining us wherever you might be tuning in from. We wish we were all at the museum right now, but I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. And thank you all for joining us this morning on this Friday morning, wherever you might be tuning in from. We're going to go ahead and give a couple minutes for everybody to go ahead and tune in. And in the meantime, make sure you go ahead and check out MOPA.org for all the resources that we'll talk about in today's show, but also for lots of other information about the museum, latest news, as well as some really cool resources on photography, as well as some amazing online exhibitions. Also, you'll find information about the current exhibitions that are up at the museum right now that this program and some of our other programs try to bring to you virtually since we can't be there. It's really keeping with the tradition of the museum being what we like to call a museum without walls, keeping with the history of the Museum of Photographic Arts. I'm your host today. My name is Kevin Lindy, and I'm MOPA's Manager of Adult and Digital Engagement. And it's really a pleasure to be able to join all of you this Friday morning for this program, MOPA in Focus. And really the spirit of the program, MOPA in Focus, is to look at the current exhibitions, the big ideas that we try to cover in them, as well as the artists that are featured in it, and to not only take a look at their work, but also to see how it links with our collection. The Museum of Photographic Arts we're coming up on almost our 40th year anniversary, which is really special. And what we like to do is look back into that collection, right? Look and see what kinds of interesting tie-ins we can bring to the works on view and the collection. And for today, we're going to be looking at one of our exhibitions that's up at the museum right now called Illusion, the Magic of Motion. And that's a really special exhibition. I like to think all our exhibitions are really special, but that one really takes a look at, as the title suggests, what early experiments and early artists were doing to capture details of a world that is always in motion, right? Oftentimes we think of the camera like our eye, and sometimes it is, but a lot of times photography allows us to see things, details, or aspects of things that are in motion that we can't necessarily make out just by looking at it, right? All of us have probably had the experience where we take a photograph of something and we think it's going to be one thing, and then once we take that photograph and we capture that moment in time, right? We look at it a little bit closer and we start to notice all of these things that didn't even cross our mind or wasn't even really on our radar when we were looking at the scene in real life. So today, again, keeping with the spirit of that exhibition, Illusion, the Magic of Motion, we're going to take a look at three artists that are part of that exhibition right now at the museum. And those artists are Eadweard Muybridge, Jacques-Henri Lartigue, awesome French name, and Harold Eugene Edgerton. And those three artists are really going to take us from some of the earliest experiments in trying to, again, capture details that oftentimes just fly by, right? And they'll sort of take us up through the 20th century. So some of the more later developments, and we'll see some images that I think all of you are going to find familiar and have probably seen out in the world. And one of the things I love to do too with the content in our exhibitions and the images in our collection is really look at these broader connections and look at, what does Eadweard Muybridge taking stop motion photographs of a horse running down a racetrack, what does that have to do with us today, right? And if any of you have been staying safe at home and maybe sharing a bunch of memes, those wonderful GIFs, right, or GIFs that have an image or a short clip with some text paired with it, I would say if you're familiar with those, then we can really look at Eadweard Muybridge way back in the 1800s. We can draw this beautiful parallel, this beautiful link. Because what Eadweard Muybridge did by capturing these freeze frames of something that's otherwise going very fast, that links all the way up through things like stop motion animation, things like memes and GIFs and things that we're all familiar with today, maybe just in a little bit of a different sense with our smartphones. Certainly quite different than his setup and some of these other photographers. So let's go ahead and head on into Eadweard Muybridge and our first artist. And some of you, again, might be familiar with Eadweard Muybridge and his work. I'm going to pull up a photo here first, though, of the artist himself, because it really speaks to some of his early work before the things that we have on view at the museum. And we can see here, the image is probably a little bit small, but we can see here this giant redwood here in California. And if we look closely, we can see the artist. He's actually sitting there at the foot of the tree. And Eadweard Muybridge was born in the UK and later moved to the United States in his 20s, and that was in the mid-1800s. And actually, a lot of his early work was exploring the West. A lot of photographers at the time, in sort of the mid-1800s, think of the ideas of manifest destiny and those expeditions and explorations of the great American West. Eadweard Muybridge was part of some of those groups, working with photographers like Carleton Watkins, and they were creating these images of the landscape, right? In order to take those back to places like the East Coast and to Europe and to share them with everyone. So we can see his early work was quite a bit different. He was making these wet plate colloidian images, we would call them, and they were these beautiful landscapes picturing Yosemite, picturing things like the Great Redwoods. He even had a mobile darkroom, actually, that ran into a little bit of an accident once, and he had to actually recover for a few years and take some time off. And that's, I think, a really interesting thing, because we see then a transition of his work. Then he returns to California and he starts experimenting with, again, using photography to show us details of the world that we otherwise might not be able to see because they're moving so fast, right? They're sort of just beyond our perception. And that brings us into an image that I think a lot of you might be familiar with. And you'll see that one there rolling on screen. And what we see is we see a grid of images, right? And we see this horse. And we can see, again, we would use the word stop motion, right? We see this sort of chronology, right, over time as the horse was walking and its gait. And we see two perspectives, right? We can see the perspective from the side to see how the horse's legs are moving. And then towards the bottom there, let me go ahead and full screen this. Towards the bottom, we actually have the horse coming towards the camera. And I think a lot of you might be familiar with this too if you've ever doodled in a sketchbook or maybe in the margins of a textbook, right? And you can create your own little stop motion animation. And on each page, you make sure the whatever you're sketching or drawing has a slight change to it. And then suddenly you flip those pages and suddenly everything blends together, right? Into the illusion of motion. And again, getting at the name of the exhibition that we have up at the museum right now, Illusion, the Magic of Motion. So Eadweard Muybridge did this using a really interesting setup. And that setup was this wonderful track that he devised. He had this set up here in California. He worked with Leland Stanford of Stanford University, and to really look into what exactly is the horse's legs doing. A lot of people point to a story, right, of there was a bet that the horse's legs all left the ground. Some people said no, a horse's legs, at least one of them, is always on the ground. And so in steps photography, at this really interesting moment where people like Eadweard Muybridge were thinking of it in a way to use it scientifically, right? To document some of these things because they realized there was a capability there. So we have this image of what looks like a booth with all of these numbers along it. And then if we look in the foreground closer towards the camera, we can see these wires laid out. And this was actually before photography and before cameras had all these wonderful built-in functions that allowed us to take high-speed photographs within one camera. This was actually a racetrack where inside that booth there was a series of cameras, and those cameras were connected to an early electromagnetic switch or trip switch, and that's where you see those trip wires. So you can think about it as the horse or as whatever was going down the racetrack, it was tripping each one of those trip wires, which was then taking a photograph at that very moment. And so again, string them together, and suddenly we have images like this image, right? We can then see how at each step it was tripping the wire and it was snapping one of these photographs. And of course the subjects had a backdrop, which was kind of this sort of interesting just wall, this white wall that was stretched out, which allowed the details to really be seen in the final photograph. Of course, I couldn't resist because, I look at Muybridge and I think, I try to imagine these things, if we were to kind of print them all out and cut them and lay them on top and flip through them like a flip book, right? What it would be like. And so I have a treat for all of us here today, which is I went ahead and actually animated one of Muybridge's prints. This is the animation of that image that we all saw just there a moment ago, and it's playing at a specific frame rate, right? So frames per second, we can think of just those stills playing, how many per second. And so suddenly we have this scene from the 1880s of this jockey on a horse, and again, suddenly animated, bringing to life this motion. Now, of course, this image isn't the most famous one. The most famous one is the one where the horse was in full gallop, right? And we can see how the horse's all four legs literally leave the ground. And that, of course, helped settle some of those bets that was out there that they were discussing early on. But it's this really wonderful sort of early experiment, right, in motion. And so another image that I have that I'd like to share with everyone is kind of building off of his work on the horse. He later went on to move to the East Coast and worked at the University of Pennsylvania. Shout out to everyone in Pennsylvania, myself as a native Pennsylvanian, and there in Philadelphia. And at the University of Pennsylvania, he really embarked on this systematic study of what he called animal locomotion. And so this was in a very special studio that he had designed, which had a lot of natural light pouring in. And then the backdrop was a grid. So again, thinking of, how do we capture these details and think about them or be able to study them in a systematic and a scientific way. And this image here that we have is another one of those studies, and what we have is it's actually a human study as part of that animal locomotion project. And we have this figure, it's a gentleman who's walking along carrying a bucket, right? Or a pail. And we can see, again, two perspectives, which was really important, again, for this sort of thinking about it scientifically. We see him from the side, and then we also see him from behind, walking away from the camera. And again, it allowed for not only Muybridge, but also for anyone who was looking into these things, the ability to study these details more closely, because of course, for us, it's oftentimes just a blur, right? Our eyes see something in motion, and our brain is constantly fusing those things together, right? Because it's such a fluid situation. But once we go ahead and take a photograph that's fast enough, and that's key, suddenly we have something frozen in whatever position it was in, and we have this wonderful sort of film strip, if you will, of these things in motion. And of course, again, couldn't resist. I went ahead and animated this gentleman as well, and I'm going to go ahead and roll that on screen, and you can see again, it's a really magical thing to have these early still images of something that was occurring in front of the camera, and to reanimate them and see something, this gentleman in the 1880s, 1890s, walking in this special studio in Philadelphia, and again, recreating that illusion, right? That illusion of motion. It was a really special thing. So I encourage all of you to check out more about Eadweard Muybridge. There's so many resources out there. And of course, these are just two examples of the different studies that he did. His work was really wide-ranging and covered a lot of different things. But the animal locomotion covered everything from animals to American bison to humans in different poses and positions to really study these different things. The next artist that I wanted us to go ahead and take a look at didn't necessarily dedicate himself to the study of motion, but the way I like to think of his work is so many of the things he looked at were about things that were in motion that he was able to freeze, because photography was at a very particular time in its development, and I think that's a really critical thing for us to talk about. And so this is one of the images right here, and again, the photographer's name was Jacques-Henri Lartigue, and he was a French photographer. He was born in the late 1800s, worked through the 1900s, and he was really pioneered using a Kodak Brownie camera and other sort of cameras that were coming out to market that people were able to have better access to. So not as complex as Eadweard Muybridge's setup of multiple cameras that had plates and tripwires. This was at a time when photography was getting just fast enough that you didn't have to do the static portrait of people leaning on pillars against fancy backdrops and everything. This was a time where film was getting a little bit quicker, camera shutters were getting a little bit faster, or maybe even had a couple different options that you could play around with. And what we see here, even though, again, Lartigue did not approach these things as a scientific study of motion, he was able to capture things that were happening in motion. And I love this image because this image is this sort of derby ride, right? This derby race, this race car that we can see these three gentlemen on. And what's really wonderful about it is we can get that wonderful sense of motion. And he did that a couple ways. Obviously, it was during the day and it was brightly lit, but then also he panned slightly, and by that I mean he moved the camera to follow the subject just so slightly so we can see the background and the foreground are a bit blurred, but we have actually a pretty crisp image of the subjects on that race car. Again, this really magical thing, because otherwise, if we were to see this scene in real life, clearly it would have just zoomed by, right? We wouldn't necessarily get to see it in such a freeze frame detail. Another one of his images too, which I wanted to share with everyone, is this wonderful image. And I promise for all of you animal lovers out there, no animal was hurt. The dog was not hurt in the making of this image, to our knowledge. But there is this image of a family friend of Lartigue with his dog, and sort of tossing the dog, right, or helping the dog, I like to think, hopefully, across this canal. And again, we have this wonderful freezing of motion in the image, right? And again, this was kind of a new thing for people, to be able to have something, again, that arrests the motion that would otherwise look like just a blur happening in front of our eyes. Again, sort of a really special thing. And again, Lartigue, having taken this photo, he wasn't using very special equipment. He wasn't using high-speed cameras or anything like that. He was literally just using a camera that had gotten to a point where he was able to take these photographs that really capture motion. And so at this point, I want to go ahead and remind everyone that if you haven't got a chance yet to subscribe to our YouTube channel, if you're following us on YouTube right now, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because we'll bring you all these awesome programs on Friday, as well as some other really cool content. And then, of course, head on over to MOPA.org. Like I said, we've got lots of really cool information over there on our current exhibitions. We have a lineup of really awesome online exhibitions, and then we have other resources exploring things like this, some of these really big ideas in photography as it relates to our exhibitions, or as it relates to the collection of over 9,000 images at the museum. So please make sure to head on over to those places, because you'll get a lot more information, and you'll also get news and information about any of the upcoming shows that we've got to bring to you all, wherever you might be tuning in from. So the last photographer that I wanted to get to today kind of brings us up to things that we might be a bit more familiar with today, and that's this gentleman right here. And this is Harold Eugene Edgerton. And Harold Edgerton was an American photographer. He was born in Nebraska and actually pursued degrees in science and studied science and engineering. He later went on to MIT, where he was faculty, and he developed a lot of new techniques, not only related to photography, but other sciences, everywhere from sonar imaging and echolocation to particular kinds of tools and instrumentation to be able to study details scientifically. And one of his biggest developments that relates to our show today is the stroboscope. And now this stroboscope, and we can see this in the image actually here, briefly, this is him in a studio holding a balloon, and we can see the balloon has been pierced. And it's just at the moment that it was pierced and it's beginning to pop. And we can see him frozen, right, holding the balloon and looking on. And these images were made possible because he actually used this stroboscope, which, if we've all been to a theater production or even a nightclub or somewhere that's had a strobe going, we can see the really strange effect that it has in almost making something that's in motion look stop motion. So he devised this device, the stroboscope, that actually flashed this bright flash at over 120 times per second, which was a really huge advance at the time. And what that allowed is, it allowed that bright pop, right? That bright flash allowed a proper exposure photographically that could capture the image, right? And a lot of us are familiar with this. You know, we take a photo at nighttime without flash. the shutter's open for a long time, things are kind of blurry and fuzzy, but suddenly we turn on the flash and we take the photo, and bam, whatever we took, whatever was in front of the camera is frozen, right? And it's well focused and it's well lit, and it had a quicker exposure time. So we can kind of think about how that relates to Edgerton's work. And Edgerton created some images that I think we're all really familiar with. This one, perhaps some of you have seen, and it's called the Coronet of a milk droplet in cranberry juice. So we have this really wild image. I'm going to go ahead and full screen it here. But, you know, for any of us who have poured ourselves coffee in the morning, or maybe it reminds you of your bowl of cereal in the morning, you know, the fluid of milk or of juice hitting a particular surface, right? So thinking about surface tension. We have this wonderful image where it's a droplet hitting the top of the liquid, and then what happens to it, right? And again, if we're looking at this with just our own eyes, it happens in a flash, and we oftentimes can't see the details, but we see the natural world has these gorgeous details, and I love that it's called coronet, right? It looks like a crown of all these droplets as the physics involved with fluids and surface tension play out in front of the camera and in front of Edgerton's stroboscope that was actually able to capture this motion so beautifully. And Edgerton, again, worked in a lot of different fields and applied some of these things, his love for photography and also science and engineering, and developing new tools and techniques for being able to, again, push at the boundaries of what photography can capture, and in turn what photography can show us about a world that is constantly moving, right? Another one of his really famous images, which I think a lot of you are going to be very familiar with, is this one. And we have this image, this frozen motion of a bullet going through an apple at just the moment where it's piercing and going out the other side. And again, we get to see the wonderful physics at work that's really going on in this image. We can see, again, how things like gravity and surface tension and all these things play out with these different materials. And of course, he would have had a very special studio set up for this. He wasn't doing this in the comfort of his home. Probably a good thing, right? And I encourage all of you not to try this one at home. Maybe the milk droplet, go for it. But this one, probably not so much. But again, it really reveals to us these details that we often can't see, right? And we all know how fast things like this travel, and it happens beyond our perception. So again, to be able to slow down and freeze these details is a really, really special thing. And again, as I mentioned, Edgerton went on to contribute to lots of different fields and led to developments in everything from sonar imaging that allows us to see the depths of the ocean, to also some of the nuclear tests that happened during the Cold War in the United States in the 20th century. Some of those images that you see of the first experiments and detonation of nuclear devices, where we see it just at the moment that it begins, and we see this really foreboding orb of light suspended in air. Edgerton was part of those teams that was trying to look at what was happening within a fraction of a second during these experiments, and how scientists can then use those things along with other observations and other data to really get a better understanding. It's kind of an interesting thing because science is always relying on things like data and mathematics and so many different points of pulling in information. But visuals are really important because, again, they allow all of us to kind of process those things. For any of you who aren't a nuclear physicist or an engineer or mathematician, I think all of us can really appreciate these images because it takes some of these really big, broad ideas and puts them into an image, a visual that all of us can relate to. And I think that really speaks to the special role of photography. Again, not only revealing details that we otherwise can't see because they're happening so fast or so quickly, but also being able to present them in a way that's really approachable for all of us, right? A visual. We can certainly relate much more to this image than we can to, say, a spreadsheet or a graph of velocity or some equation of different fluids and tensions and matter. So I think that's a really special thing, and that's really also why I'm always super inspired by our exhibitions at the museum because, again, they take these big, broad concepts and they bring them in a visual way that we can all really relate to, which is, again, a really special thing. So that's all we have for this week. I want to thank all of you again for joining us wherever you're tuning in from. And again, just as a reminder, make sure you head on over to mopa.org for all the latest information on both the museum, but also to check out some of the really cool content that we have. And then, of course, if you're on social, make sure you share with us some of the different things that you're seeing and that you're looking at in the world. Maybe today inspires you to take a look at some of the different functions on your smartphone or to set the dial on your DSLR to explore some of those really rapid shutter speeds and to explore how some of these things play out for you all wherever you might be tuning in from. I want to make sure also all of you get to join us next week for another MOPA in Focus. And we're actually going to be kind of taking today's topic and going one step further, and we're going to be exploring how a contemporary Chinese artist is using new technologies that are in and around us today to really invite us all into a really immersive experience. So 2 letters for that, VR. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that and how it relates to photography, but how it also allows all of us to really experience a sense of place or a narrative using these photographic tools in really interesting, innovative, and new ways. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Take care, be safe, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week for another MOPA in Focus.